You've done it once again. Please tell us about Esoterica and how the launch is going.
Well, the launch is going really well. In fact, it's been hugely gratifying. There's an astringency in the book, and I was concerned before launch that that astringency would prove alienating, but by and large, it seems to greet people in a refreshing way. It's obviously written with a sense of urgency because I think humanity is in decline on a macro scale, but more immediate to my interests on an individual scale. We all feel like we're living in an ersatz reality, which we are.
Mm.
It's called digital media, but it's not limited to digital media. And our psyches, I think, are being absolutely strained by an excess of relationships and excess of conformity, an excess of hostility. And I write about those things with some urgency, and that's been received well overall.
Interesting. So, what would you say your core thesis in the book is?
I think all of us as individuals are subjecting ourselves to useless suffering. There is a form of suffering that's useful. Maybe it's some kind of conscious labors to work on self. Maybe it's some kind of payment of debt, broadly defined. But I think that we engage in a lot of useless suffering by accepting excessive signaling from social media, by
Mm,
a- suffering internalized conformity from a spiritual and therapeutic culture that
mm,
often narrows our sense of options and self because prescriptions are worded in certain ways that might bend a person towards language and concepts like service that don't fit his or her psyche. I think we have trouble naming our wishes. I think we have trouble using simple words like happiness or failure or success, that these things get taken away from us in some web of ersatz complexity. I think we need to verify what's being told to us. I think we need to honor our own point of view, and I think we need to limit our relationships. We need to know ourselves better, not allow that Delphic principle to become a refrigerator magnet,
mm.
which is what it's become, unfortunately.
When you're talking about that, the first thing I was going to ask is different spiritual traditions think that the world is either progressing in a better way or declining. For instance, with the traditionalists, but I think a more interesting question would be, um, it seems to me that, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. I mean, it seems like to me that people are meeting, they're hitting instantaneous interconnection with all other consciousnesses, that
Mhm,
they don't have any type of, like the West killed God to Nietzsche's dismay
mhm,
at the beginning of the 20th century. So we don't have any ethical framework or sense of, or maybe a better way to put it is religion gives people a set of fixed principles or
yeah.
structures for interacting with reality, that people fall back on in times of confusion, or simply use to live a better life. Without any of that, yeah, people are just contacting the suffering of other people without being able to contextualize it, perhaps.
There's so much in that to unpack. First of all, I do believe that we're declining. I think the
Yeah.
greatest nostrum of New Age culture, a culture towards which I have no negativity whatsoever. I freely apply the term New Age to myself. I see it as a radically ecumenical culture of therapeutic spirituality. I don't use New Age as an epithet, but I split deeply with the New Age concept that an evolution of consciousness is going on. I see no evidence
Mm,
for that. I
mm,
can't verify that. Around the world, to a person, we all say we're against war. There should never be another war. It's horrendous. It's irrational. Well, wars keep happening. So you can see this great chasm between stated belief and actual human activity. And if that's not indication of decline, what else can be? At the same time, I don't want to be hypocritical about it because some of us, myself included, function very well in this decline. This decline might substitute certain technological or medical advances, let's say, for aspects of self-development. And I would be lying to your viewers if I didn't say that I participate in some of those benefits as well. The current of life is the current of decline. We don't have Buddha, we have Buddhism. We don't have Christ, we have Christianity. Um, we don't have the sages of Judea, we have Judaism. So there's a decline in within the current and context of life. I also understand and share with you the sense of crisis around our lack as a human community of ethical principles, whether they emanate from religion or somewhere else. I find that there's a slender fraction of people who are emotionally sensitive, who really harbor in their psyches and their bodies a sense of reciprocity. In the Vedic tradition, it might be called karma, a much larger impersonal force, which Nietzsche was brilliant, I think, at capturing in his own way. Emerson called it compensation. I tend to use the term reciprocity. I do believe this human connectedness exists, but it's it's felt in earnest by a tiny fraction of people whose emotional sensitivity is there innately.
Hmm.
Gurdjieff used to call it a magnetic center, and I think those of us who are part of that web know one another, and we know one another by the experience of reciprocity. We know one another by the experience of pausing before making a statement or asking a question that could serve to diminish another person or his or her efforts. I find the lack of ethical compass points once you get outside of that fraction of humanity to be appallingly absent, shockingly absent. They get replaced by politics, by self positioning, by political statements, by claims of virtue based upon accidental traits like geography or demography or something like that. And in that too, I think we see humanity's decline. I don't nostalgize the past or have any wish to go backwards. There was no good old days for humanity. But if one speaks of these things in terms of human awareness, the human psyche, um, consciousness, a very difficult concept to define, attention, somewhat of an easier concept to define, then the signs of decline, I think,
Hmm, hmm, hmm,
are
hmm.
eminent.
So I was going to ask you, that raises the question, by what metric are we gauging the decline or appreciation or improvement of human consciousness? And then you suggested a few at the end, like
Mhm.
attention. One thing that occurred to me is when you're talking about the conscious people, or the Sangha, as the Buddhists would put it, or the Illuminati, as Robert Anton Wilson put it. Um, one check one the way that I tend to know I'm talking with a conscious person is if, they are when we're speaking, they're listening instead of waiting to talk.
And you could sense it as a physical sensation. Yeah.
Yep.
You can see that their body, their gait, they're leaning forward. I used to know one man, he's now dead. When another party was talking, his lips would be moving. Oh, there's Jacqueline Castel, my
Hello.
my wife, making a cameo
Hello.
appearance. Hi,
Hello.
Jacqueline. Say hi to Jason's audience. Uh,
Hello, Jacqueline.
um, I knew a man now dead whose lips would actually move, almost like he was a ventriloquist while other people were talking. He was so eager to get out what he had to say in reaction to his mind's eye perception of what they were saying, or what they were going to say. And that's just an extreme example of behavior that touches all of us, this penchant to lean forward with the readiness of response because, because it's quite all right. Because, because um, we already have a crystal clear fantasy imagination of what that person is saying. It's deadly. It's deadly. And again,
Yeah,
there's areas where this decline that I describe, I can do very well in this decline where I describe. Um, Look, here we are on Zoom, separated by a time zone, and I'm glad to be talking to you.
me too.
I'm doing just fine in the Kali Yuga. But that the Kali Yuga exists shows up, as you were just saying, in literal incapacity to listen, literal incapacity to sit still, literal a paucity of attention that is shocking and covered up only by scrolling on one's phone,
Yeah.
and inability to not talk as well. This used to be more common years ago before the phone craze, but you'd walk into an elevator, for example, and people would be making noise, shuffling, humming, whistling, coughing, talking to you about the weather because silence feels like a kind of death.
Hmm. 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 Yeah, I once went to a sensory deprivation tank place in Pasadena, and the person working there said that it was amazing that almost everyone who went there had never spent more than a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes alone with themselves. And not just the tank, but being alone in silence for 30 minutes, an hour was a new experience for most people. So as an introvert, rather introverted individual, this is completely inconceivable to me, but there you have it.
It's I would venture that most people couldn't sit still for 30 seconds. We used to say in the Gurdjieff work, can someone sit still for 10 minutes? That was years ago. With the advent of carry it with you media,
Mm.
I think that's eroded. I'm a victim of it myself. Possibly the only quiet I have. Well, I'm not even sure it's true that it's quiet. I sit in transcendental meditation twice daily, but I'm repeating a mantra in my head. I sleep at night, obviously, but I'm dreaming and my thoughts are racing. I don't know if that can be called silence. In any case, inability to accommodate silence is is worsening. And it's worsening even to the extent that we as a public can't participate in events together unless there's riotous noise going on. In the absence of that riotous noise, you'll even see people at, say, concerts that are more on the quiet side, like a ballet or a classical concert or something of that nature. They're conducting in the air, they're singing along, they're checking their phones, and this is the human situation. Are we human?
What is human?
Yeah. I mean, we're automatons. We're biological machines
Mm.
made of flesh and blood. I probably go through life with 20 some odd responses. It's constantly going on, constantly going on. I'm reading situations to pick up certain signals, and my retinue of what I pick up and what I communicate back out is so narrow, it's horrifying. And we are, as good automatons, asleep to that process. There's a somnambulance, a hypnotism, a buffering so that we don't see these things in ourselves, because if we could see our own inhumanity, I think it would be too much to cope with.
Yes, quite likely. I think that, man, um, one thing that occurred to me when you were talking about people not being able to converse properly, um, one of the things in I would say whatever you want to call it, like for me, like practical spiritual work is pretty much in relationships and relating to other people and making sure that I'm not casting projections onto other people
Mhm,
and
mhm,
monitoring my own shadow and this is very difficult and a lot more difficult than adding up Kabbalah or something like that. But
mhm,
one of the worst parts that when you begin to catch it is if you're listening to somebody waiting to speak, when you do speak, you're speaking to what you think they think and said, not what they actually did, because you also didn't hear what they said.
mhm,
And this causes I think a lot of just human suffering. A lot of human suffering comes from just in it, like what you're saying, like that difficulty of communication. You were even saying you're getting 20 inputs every day, but as we know, we filter very small amount of it and we're able to communicate back even less.
mhm.
Um, and it also makes me think of mirror neurons when we were talking about people's connection to each other. And even the thing you said when you said, when somebody's waiting to talk, they lean forward.
Mhm,
I don't know a whole lot about mirror neurons, but I understand that when two people are talking, their neurons begin to mirror each other, and this is the
mm,
empathy effect that can be measured.
mm,
And then when somebody is in rapport with you, you can tell it. You can tell that's mirror neurons. And I think there's also mirror neurons are responsible for when we see somebody else suffering and we feel the pain physically and involuntarily in our body. Not like we think, oh, they're suffering, but like you actually feel like a twitch or a cringe when you see something. Believe that's also mirror neurons.
hmm.
Um, These are more things that have these are more inspirations that have come into my head as you've been speaking than questions.
This question of what we perceive is one that tormented the idealist philosophers, for example. Their attitude, this included Kant among others, was that ultimately it's the mind perceiving itself. It's the filter of self, an elusive concept, defining sensory experience and calling it reality. And this plays havoc with our ability to understand what other people think and even understand what I think about myself, my own self-image. I'm using other people
Mm,
as a mirror of self-image, but my experience of other people is imagination. And I'm going to stop from overstating that because there are certain objective experiences, I believe. And I will, on rare occasion, witness someone take an action that I think is objective. The
uh,
other day, for example, some reader, anonymous, I don't know who it was, I don't know his name because he used a pseudonym, sent me $100 because he liked Esoterica so much, and I was very moved by that. Um, of course, it's always nice to get $100, but it wasn't the sum, it was the act, and I felt there is someone who was paying for something, broadly defined, broadly defined. I speak a lot in the new book of debt, and everybody wants to know, "What do you mean by debt?" And half the people ask that because they think it's just money, and half the people ask that because they want to exclude money. And I mean it in the broadest possible of ways, not excluding money. And I want to be very plain about that. The only things that we have to give another person are time and money. And
mm,
spare me the
mm,
fantasies, please. Because if my neighbor Mike doesn't have money to pay the rent, he fuck well wants money from me. And if I have it, I will give it to him. But we indulge in these fantasies that we have something to give another person other than time and money.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it's not the only thing I mean by debt. We're all in debt, and the capacity to recognize that debt is a objective experience, I think. Like, I'm speaking to you from the borough of Brooklyn in New York City. Well, if I turn on the water tap, clean water comes out. I have electricity. Bombs aren't falling on me. I didn't earn any of that. I'm just here accidentally as a happy accident. And I'm here because of the suffering of people who came before me, who made a very arduous voyage to be here, not knowing their own safety, not knowing their own abilities to function once they arrived in this place. And generations later, here I am. I have a debt for that. I eat meat. I have a debt for that. I hurt people without meaning to. I have a debt for that. Those are objective experiences, but they come and go quickly, and we mustn't collect them. And then
Hmm.
once I start collecting them, they turn into vacation photographs.
Well, then they all show up in your mind at 4 in the morning when you're trying to show up all at once and they
Right,
fit in you.
right. Or like people in our spiritual culture love collecting experiences, and they want to know about my experiences from haunted houses to speaking to Jehovah. And I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about that because
Hmm,
that's all just memories if it exists at all.
hmm, hmm.
And those memories become trophies and
Yeah.
they're just like
Yeah.
anything else. We collect them.
Trump, yeah, as I'm sure the image that Shogyam Trungpa used was like, well, he said, Americans are materialists, and then when they get into spirituality, they do the same thing with with just exactly what you're saying, collecting
Yeah.
experiences. And he used the image of somebody's garage overflowing with stuff they're not using, and that's basically all your esoteric stuff that one has collected.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I do it. I try to
that
be
stuff's all fun,
transparent. Hmm?
It's all fun and cool, though, all of it.
It depends. The aesthetics certainly are. I've got my Madame Blavatsky T-shirt on. This was a gift from the youth section of the Theosophical
Oh, very
Society.
cool.
Um, and and yet I do think there's a place for acquisition, and I do think there's a place for aspiration within our spirituality because I can't draw this neat line of demarcation that separates one thing from the other. And resources in this, look, the demand for resources is constant. It's necessary. It's part of life. I think a lot of spiritual teachers, including Christ, have made the observation that a person who's, well, as Gurdjieff used to put it, weak in the world, weak in the work. A person who can't manage resources, can't be counted on, can't keep their word, can't repay a just and valid debt, can't water a house plant. What are they bringing to questions of ultimacy? So
Mm.
I I take all those things very seriously.
Your comments about, to some extent, if I understand what you were saying correctly, so correct me if I'm not understanding what you're saying, but um, the as the German idealists pointed out, as Wittgenstein pointed out, as Bishop Berkeley and Hume and the Scottish people and the 2,500 years of Buddhism have pointed out, basically, and Hermeticism, all is mind. We
Mm,
really cannot perceive past our sensory apparatus. Um, So we're to some extent bound to understanding ourselves through the mirror of other people and their reaction to us.
mhm,
Am I understanding more or less what you said with that?
mhm, mhm, yeah,
That made me think of two songs, and you'll appreciate this. The first is Funhouse by the Stooges,
mhm,
where you're caught in the funhouse of all the weird mirrors and you're lost
mhm,
in everyone's perception of you being thrown back at you. And the one I thought of first was the Kraftwerk song, uh, or the line is, "Every artist discovers themselves in the hall of mirrors. And every artist discovers themselves in the hall of mirrors,
Mhm.
and that suggests two things. Either it suggests the type of insane feedback loop
Mhm.
of non-silence, of phone culture, of constantly needing not just validation from other people, but proof of life. I
Mm.
think a lot of people chase likes and interactions and all that, not necessarily out of egotism, but simply it reminds we wanna know that we're checked, that we're still alive, that people like us, at least somebody likes us, and that we matter, right? That
Yeah.
we contacted somebody else. So it suggests either a madness of that where one cannot be self-defined and is lost in the chaos of, the Quran's of endless information media, or it could suggest, just the ability to connect with more people around the world, and actually come to a larger empathetic set of people beyond like a 150 Dunbar's number. And that essentially, were we to develop a proper ethics being distinguished from morality, morals, which I think people conflate. A
Mhm.
proper set of ethics or a framework for interacting with reality could most likely be the difference between, you know, uh, the constant interconnection, electronic intermeshing of everyone, causing global chaos and meltdown, or global empathy.
These are interesting questions. Um, I'm aware of what's going on around the world. The extent to which I feel empathy that's meaningful, I don't know. I'm aware, for example, I used to hear from readers in Iran, and I treasured every
Mm.
such communication, and I no longer do.
Me too. Me too. Yeah, I've had a few things where people have said they like I was giving courses away in Iran. I was like, "You can just have courses. You so you need it, if you wanna
Yeah,
overthrow your government, here you go." But
yeah.
yeah.
And what do? I shake my head and I do nothing. I just do nothing. So I really just don't know. I I have drawn around me in life at this juncture a very small number of people. I try to abide the needs of a very small number of people because it's real to me. My children, my wife, um, there's not a hell of a lot else. Online, I think I'm so busy trying to be seen that I find the whole enterprise repugnant. I feel that as I'm saying these words right now. I don't like the present culture all
Mm.
that much. I don't participate in it all that much. I can't even imagine wanting to go on TikTok. Um, I don't think I'm wanted there. I don't want to be there. I find that more and more I'm happy in small numbers of people. I'm happy communicating in public like we're doing right now, but then having the ability to retreat into a very small zone of privacy. I suppose that's a very common personality type among artists. I think it's sometimes called, maybe on that Myers-Briggs scale, which one used to hear about, it's called introvert extrovert. That's probably what you are too, enjoying being out there in the world, but then really wanting to retreat back
Yeah.
into a zone of privacy. I don't think it's possible for empathy to exist en masse. A teacher of mine who's now dead used to say that people think that becoming more spiritually aware is going to make them happier, but what it really means, perhaps, is that you feel other people's suffering more. And in so feeling that suffering, happiness could be very, very distant. I hope I feel the suffering of other people, but I'm sure that I feel it only in intimate situations. I could talk to you all day about what's going on in Iran or Ukraine or Saudi or what have you, but I think that's mechanical. I'm sorry to say. this business of saying I'm against war, and yet there I go, embracing war, at least as an acceptancy. It characterizes all of humanity. And I don't know what much else there is to be said for humanity en masse in that kind of situation.
Hmm. I really do strive to, as you said, keep a very small circle, but also, um, electronic media allows, this to both of us having this conversation feels like two people sitting in a room having a casual conversation, even though have a green screen behind me. But, potentially tens of thousands of people could listen to this.
Yeah.
If you imagine that in physically, like, it's like if you go to I think I can't even know what I think still is it still the Crypto.com arena? It used to be the Lakers Stadium in LA. It was the Nokia Center for a while. Um, but so I don't even know what they call it now, but, if you go to a Lakers game, it's about 9,000 people, and it's one of those huge circular stadiums with everyone, filling the seats.
Mhm,
I saw Tony Robbins do an event there, and the whole thing was packed, and it's like, I'm sitting there looking at this like, my god, like, just the amount of reach this guy has. He's got 9,000 people just in this room, and he's on tour. Of course,
mhm,
he's probably got so many more online, but then again, let's say 10, 20, 30,000 people listen to this. That's 3, 4, potentially 4 times the amount of that stadium. You just can't
mhm,
see them. But at the same
mhm,
time, we're experiencing it in a relaxing, introverted way instead of, having to have, microphones on and flashing lights and teams and people, and that's very, very stressful,
mm,
managing all that, so
mhm. Yes, interesting. I often pine for the experience that Robbins has of having that kind of a mass audience, but I don't think I understand what that would really mean, and I'm not sure. I experience the opinion of one individual more acutely than I do experience the opinion of 10,000
mm,
individuals. I've noticed that if somebody says something crude to me, I feel bad. If 10,000 people say something crude to me, I don't give a shit because mobs are not human, and so
right, well,
I wouldn't know what Tony experiences. Yeah, I wouldn't know. I mean, he experiences the adulation of a mob. Probably that's not very comforting in the sense that it comes and goes, and mobs aren't really human. And
yeah.
I don't know that it serves to satisfy the individual. But this is all speculation. I I don't know the experience firsthand. People say money can't make you happy. Well, everyone who says that either has no money or has
Not
lots of
having money can sure make you not happy, though.
fucking A. I think we all know
It
that,
should
right? We
it's
verified
amazing how that works.
that is a verified objectivity. And,
Yeah, yeah, so
um
it's like the reverse of the statement is non-falsifiable, so there you
right.
go. Hilarious.
I hear sometimes super successful people saying, "Oh, success can't make you happy." But of course, if I could, I would challenge them then to give up all their success, then know what it means to never have had a best-selling book, know what it means to be playing a coffee shop down the street versus Madison Square Garden, and then we'll see whether success makes you happy. A person has to know, a person has to experience the thing before they can talk about sacrificing it, before they can talk about whether or not it is valuable. And it's funny, in my book, Daydream Believer, I write at the very beginning of the book, every word true and verifiable by the reader. Some guy
That's great that yeah, that's great, that's great.
some guy wrote an essay, an op-ed, about how winning doesn't make you happy. This culture of contest that we're all in. Coming out on top in that culture doesn't make you happy. We have to get more in touch with so-called mediocrity. We have to get more in touch with just being happy in the median, in the middle. I kid you not, The essay reached me because it was on the op-ed page of the New York Times, a coveted space in and of itself. And it was in that coveted space because the guy writing it, who's a school teacher from Princeton, New Jersey, won first place in an essay writing contest sponsored by the Brooklyn Public Library. So here's the guy who enrolled in a contest, won first place in the contest, wound up on a coveted editorial page to tell the rest of us, don't covet success, be comfortable in the middle. I mean, you can't invent this stuff.
It kind of sounds like somebody kicking out the ladder once they've got to their goal.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
and it kind of sounds like a comedy skit that Mel Brooks would have written, who just turned 100 the other day. You can't invent
Oh,
this stuff, you know?
amazing.
And so we mustn't, it seems to me, we mustn't assume familiarity with anything that we don't already, know, and we mustn't say we would jettison something unless we really have a means and a ways of jettisoning that thing. And even if we do, it's still a choice. Buddha was said to be a prince, and then he became a renunciate. Well, he was a prince. It's very different renouncing something like that and then telling the public, and we get reached through this long descending current, not to be attached. Well, I don't know about that. I don't know
Right.
about that. The
It,
individual has to verify that.
it's great that you bring up Buddha. Um, and in the context of what you just said, and also in the context of what we were talking about at the beginning, which is your skepticism or perhaps dismay at the human race ever advancing and your
Mhm,
belief that we're declining.
mhm,
Um, most of and this is kind of why I was asking in so many words, what are we measuring by?
mm,
But the which I think is important to define, like what is the metric? Um, but in terms of the goal of rate changing consciousness, the thesis being there is something inherently wrong with human consciousness in its present state. That is what causes the problems in the world. If we change the consciousness, the problems will go away or change into something else.
mhm,
And so that's the basic equation of Buddhism, Scientology,
mhm, mhm,
Christianity, the Hindu, like
mhm.
every yoga, every single religion. Um, if that was true, the Buddha has had 2,500 years to prove the thesis. And I see no, you know, in prior to the Mughal invasions, the whole of Northeast India was Buddhist and practicing awakening techniques, and they all got slaughtered, unfortunately, during the Mughal invasion. But that was after the reign of the Emperor Ashoka. But it's kind of like if you like proof of, so there's your proof of concept. It worked until it hit Islam. So we don't have to go down that route, but that just occurred to me. But so far that plan hasn't really worked out, and a lot of people have been trying that for thousands, for 25, at least 2,500 years. If we want to go back to earlier religions, even Manichaeism, Zoroastrian, anything, any
Yeah,
totalized,
I dig.
yeah.
It's interesting. If humanity were advancing in some measurable way, and if humanity was what we think it is, if I was what I think I am, any great religious text would be sufficient to save us. The Dhammapada would
Mhm.
save us. The Bhagavad Gita would save us. The Beatitudes would save us. The Tao Te Ching would save us. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius would save us. Nietzsche would
Yeah,
save us.
yeah, yeah.
And one can't say that we haven't had the chances and we don't know the wisdom literature. Never has it been so available to so many people on such an instant notice. And so I sit in a chair and I nod in agreement with the Tao Te Ching, and then I violate it the instant some stimuli crosses my awareness. And that is the human situation. We all agree with know thyself. Put it on my coffee mug. Right on. It doesn't mean anything. These ideas don't penetrate. They don't penetrate. And the people that we refer to as esoteric scholars are curators.
Mhm.
They are curators of wisdom behind museum cases, glass enclosed museum cases. They are writers
Yeah.
of recipe books that we keep reading and wonder why they don't sate my hunger. It's an absolute absurdity. All the compendiums, all the translations of wisdom literature do not change being. And anyone who thinks they change being is asleep, because the sweep of history that you were just describing, horrible as it is, has repeated and repeated and repeated, and it will repeat next week.
Absolutely, and I always come back, to the Nietzsche's phrase, "History is a slaughter bench," and I also, connect that in my mind to Austin Osman Spare talks about growing up in the meat markets, and he was a working class with a policeman father, so he grew up in, I think,
Mhm,
Brixton or somewhere in East London,
mhm,
and, South London, Southeast London, and he grew up next to a meat market where people are constantly chopping up animals, and that's what he saw day in, day out, and for him, this was the world, and, he's not totally wrong there, and so this brings up the next question, which is, um, the assumption the assumption that humanity needs a change in consciousness. Okay. The first 6 lines of the Dhammapada is everything that you're saying, but if you read the first 6 lines of the Dhammapada, Pali Canon, original transmission of the Buddha, it says right there, in so many words, all these people that you're angry at, that you're resentful for, that you think ruined your life, that messed you up, those are projections of your mind, right? So, if you were, and that right there will, remove somebody from, it will cut the loop of a significant amount of suffering.
mhm.
6 lines, so it's like if people just implemented that, the world would probably be quite a bit better. But
Absolutely.
that hasn't
But I
happened.
think
So the presence of the information doesn't do it. But then
no.
it suggests another question, which is, okay, well, does humanity need to change at all? Is there, because the assumption of spirituality is that by some process, by connection to by a yogic process, of physical postures, or of intellectual learning, or of connection with meeting of great remarkable men with sages, or spiritual journey, or um, being more polite, to behaving in traffic better, all of these things um, are meant to be processes of changing a human being, but the
Mhm,
fundamental question is, do human beings need to be changed at all? Because it's a bit neurotic to think, to be born and to say, "There's something horribly fundamentally wrong with this, and I must change at least my perception of it."
mm. Well, I think that's a very valid observation, and if there's no solution to something, then there's no problem.
Mm,
I might be facing down things that are so implacable to change that they are what they are. That's why I never use terms like enlightened or awakened or realized or any of these idiotic ersatz terms that we attempt to use, because I think they're describing a state that is effectively impossible to individuals in the 21st century. And my first line of evidence for that impossibility is to scrutinize the life of the person who disagrees with me, and you'll see uh, my statement um, in activity right right there. When you look to witness the conduct of the claimant,
mhm,
and I'm deeply invested in conduct and experience as the only forms of measurement worth taking, because they're really all that's available to us.
mm,
And I also find that I'm interested presently in very, very simple things, because simple things are the only things that the individual will try. And
mm,
they're worth trying. They're worth trying. Reciting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo is worth trying. transcendental meditation or some other form of maybe zazen meditation is worth trying. These and I won't be limited in my statements. If somebody thinks that some sort of sound waves or sound frequencies can induce transpersonal experience, as is worked with at the Monroe Institute in Virginia, I've had a good experience with that. It's
Oh,
worth.
did you go to the Monroe Institute?
Yeah, about a year ago we spent a week there.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and that was a
Fascinating.
great experience,
Huh.
and on many, many, many levels. I encourage it. So I respect and I like the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the founder of Transcendental Meditation, because he had the realization that you need to meet Western man where he lives. Western man is acquisitive. Western man is involved in commerce. Western man is individualistic. He's not part of the Vedic families of India. He's not part of the caste system. He's something else. And you need to meet that individual where he or she lives. And so the technique that the Maharishi brought to the West was intended to do that. And
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
I
Same with
practiced it twice.
Yogananda earlier, where he
Yes.
dressed it up as a church, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And and I think that these things are worth trying because they meet us where we live. There are deeper forms of work that might require somewhat more of an exit of daily life. And if the individual wants to do that or can do that, whatever that may be, I say bravo, bravo. Um, to me, at this moment in my search, I'm really invested in very, very simple things. That's what appeals to my psyche. And I think that that's the best way to meet someone on his or her own terms, if that is of any interest to a person.
And by simple things, do you mean, like literal simple objects or simple practices, like simplicity of
Simple
practice?
practices,
Okay.
prayer, meditation, again, chanting. If there are innovations that seem worthwhile, maybe they're bodily, maybe they're physical, try them. Hatha yoga. I don't know that any of this has made a difference in my life, but I am trying.
You don't? Okay.
No, I'm
Interesting.
happier than I was when I was younger. That's reflected throughout my book, Esoterica. I'm 60, and I'm much happier than I was, say, 20, 30 years ago. Much, much happier.
Wonderful.
And
Wonderful. Wonderful.
so yeah, I offer whatever experience and search ethically, spiritually has brought to me in connection with that. And I won't damn the ground that I stand on. I think there's all kinds of things that can contribute to a person's happiness. And we as a spiritual culture, we as a seeking culture, shouldn't be on any high horse about it. And
Oh, I
I'm
agree completely. It's
very clear about that.
if it works for you, well, my basic ethic is that I try other people's lives are not my business.
Mhm.
I really try to stick to that. And because like, also when I was younger, when when you hear yourself at 25 pronouncing to people how your spiritual path is so much better than theirs, it's like, I'm not sure this is how it's meant to be. I'm not sure
Yeah,
I'm doing this correctly.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
I'm curious though, particularly in interacting and with so many people, what are the things well, I have 2 questions. One is, what are the simple practices that you recommend in Esoterica? And the second question is, in your broader career, they may be the same, in your broader career, what are the techniques that you feel people keep coming back to? Like, for instance, it's like, the stuff that I talk about, there's obviously so much in Western magic, but people tend to come back to yoga and the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram.
Mm,
Okay, and for me, that's very interesting. It's like, okay, well, so there's like there's like data now that these practices must be helpful enough in one way or another that large numbers of people are independently verifying that those work for them, and also by their omission of other practices, perhaps saying that there's no consensus on that. But
I agree with that. I would say the same thing in terms of Western astrology, for example, understanding the differences between the Western and the Vedic system. Why is astrology the oldest religious retention on earth? Well, because it works. There's
mm,
lots of things that we don't retain. I haven't sacrificed a bull to Zeus anytime recently. I don't use leeches when I'm feeling under the weather. There's all kinds of practices that I haven't brought with me from the book of Leviticus, but astrology, Western astrology, which I speak to only because I'm familiar with it to a greater degree than I am Vedic astrology. People are perfectly capable of defending either system.
mm. Yeah, that's an interesting one. That's an
Yeah, it
interesting one.
works. That's why.
Mm. Yeah.
Why do people see ghosts? Because ghosts exist. That's why. All the geniuses in cognitive psychology who have trained themselves about how people fool themselves over apply what they've learned in a manner akin to the magical thinking or the
What do you
cognitive
say
bias.
more about that? That's really interesting.
Oh, well, it's funny. The greatest opposition that you'll find to parapsychology, ESP research, claims of the anomalous, the paranormal come from the social sciences, chiefly cognitive psychology, because
Mm.
within that world, they spend so much time studying and codifying the various ways in which we fool ourselves. And they're right. They're right.
Mhm.
But of course, along comes J.B. Rhine almost a century ago and creates or co-creates a whole science called parapsychology that takes into account all these ways that we fool ourselves. And the cognitive psychologists in general, with exceptions, of course, they cry, "Oh, no, no, that data is not valid. It's delusional. It's based on mistakes."
Mm.
And they come up with all these ways of drilling holes in it to the point where David Hume himself would probably tell them to go to hell, that their claims are more miraculous than the
That's
thing that
interesting.
they're
I'm really curious about this, but it also occurred to me a really interesting experiment would be if you take James Randi or any of these people and like, but I like this stuff. Like, for instance, one guy that I really like, Stephen Novella. I don't know him personally, obviously, but he's a
I know him.
skeptic podcast, or he did a course on cognitive distortion and cognitive
Mm.
biases and how to spot them, and but
Well, I'd
whether
like
you
to partner with him. We'll
what
do a
was that?
course that teaches skeptical cognitive biases. Maybe he and I could collaborate together.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Well, that would be interesting, and I think that but it suddenly brings to mind, you could take, let's say, whatever James Randi, I don't know what basis he falsifies things on, but whatever the argument is about the paranormal experience, you could then take that argument and apply it to literally anything else and see
Sure.
if things that are quote unquote real hold up. Because something like that may be so rigorous that it ends up disproving everything, like existence. You know what I mean?
Right, right. Well, it disproves itself because if you could apply cognitive biases to the person who wield those things cudgel-like, you'd find that they're in denial about nearly a century of replicated, impeccably juried parapsychology research pertaining to everything from ESP to psychokinesis to even reincarnation itself, confounding topics. And part of their bias will take the form of insisting that ESP can't be real because it violates known laws of physics. Well, so does quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics and special relativity don't agree. We've known that for damn near a century.
Right.
It doesn't bother anyone because both are provable, but we tolerate contradictions in the natural sciences all the time. But
Mhm.
within the so-called soft sciences, this is what takes the form of a cognitive bias, insisting upon inconsistent application of rules, of
Huh.
laws to make
Interesting.
things go away that we don't like.
Interesting.
You may
Interesting.
remember in 2020, I wrote a counter obituary of James Randi, who was a ridiculous, although very culturally effective and soundbite adept fraud. And one of the reasons I so miss Gordon White, our recently departed colleague,
Yep.
is that I
Yeah.
was very depressed at the time because I was getting all these coordinated attacks from Randy's fans and
Oh, really?
supporters.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
And
Oh,
I said,
okay.
I don't know,
Is this
Gordon,
Psychop or something like that? They
oh, yeah, well, whatever, ragtag band.
that's such a badge of honor, though.
Mhm.
it's if the paranormal, if the skeptics come after you, that means you're
Oh,
definitely doing something paranormal.
oh, well, right? People talk to me about Epstein, and I say, take a look at who was populating Epstein's little think tank events. It was all the guys that I'm talking about who have attacked me for defending parapsychology data. I wasn't at those parties.
You mean the specific people?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Like who?
Dawkins and Steven Pinker and, Dennett and some of the people who were part of the new atheist crowd or the hardcore physicalists. That's an interesting discussion to have in and of itself, why that particular group was his, um, how would
Mm.
you put it? I guess his think tank. But anyway, Gordon, just to pay a brief tribute to a lost friend, said to me,
May peace be upon him.
yeah, said to me apropos of Randy, he said, "He's a stupid person's idea of what a smart person is." And I just needed that one laugh, and it lifted
That's
my
hilarious.
mood.
I'm curious, maybe even from like a Reichian sense, or is there a type, but to the skeptics, and by this I mean literally just like street level, like what's their physical posture, like what type of person are they? If you met them, if you were gonna spot them across the room at a party, what person would they be?
One thing I can say is that they're cynical. Um, they are they smirk. They don't smile. They smirk.
The smirk.
They are more reachable and more gentle one-on-one than they are in their group. In their group, they are unreachable. One-on-one across a table, if I said, "Hey, look, this class of experiments, let's look at this together," they would and have agreed with me in private. There's something there.
Hmm.
You don't have to concede the existence of ESP. Let's just call it a statistical anomaly arising from unpolluted data. So let's keep looking. They would agree with me in
Okay.
private.
Okay.
In public, they revert to a politics that's just impenetrable. And you could probably come up with all the psychological reasons for that, the fears, the absurdities. I think we settle on positions politically and otherwise based on what makes us feel safe. And the
Yeah.
denial of the extra physical makes them feel safe. In private, they're okay. In public, unreachable.
Interesting.
You know?
Well, one thing I learned from you is a body of scientific literature on this stuff,
Oh,
and you're
yeah.
very conversant with that. I had no I didn't know that because I've never, for me, proving whether it was real or not was never my focus. I just wanted to,
Mhm.
you know, make my life better. But, uh, you know, but, that was exciting to learn, and I still have not engaged with that literature at all. I would like to. I'm curious where what your sense of where that's at is.
Oh, it's doing really well, the study of parapsychology against all odds. There's probably only 50 scientists, at least here on the Western scene, who are able to get private funding and find time away from their academic jobs or their clinical jobs in order to conduct this research. The reason why it's so elusive in terms of reaching the public is because the very people we have been talking about, the career skeptics, the ideological skeptics, they run riot over Wikipedia. And Wikipedia is a fount of disinformation about parapsychology. Surprise, surprise. Um,
Wasn't
Wiki is
wasn't
great.
Ghislaine Maxwell like moderating half of Reddit or something like that? Maybe not half,
Oh, is
but
that right? I have no
yeah, yeah,
idea.
she was moderating at least some of the top. She was the top moderator on some of the Reddit submods. Anyways,
Oh, wow.
yeah,
How weird.
it is strange.
Um, you can learn a hell of a lot about the Napoleonic Wars from Wiki, but you can't learn a damn thing about parapsychology. It's a fount of misinformation, even to the extent where there have been studies and experiments widely replicated that I had given up on, like the retrocausality experiments of Darrell Bem at Cornell, because I had been fed so much misinformation. But then when I did the really arduous task of digging into the data and its replication, um, these things stand up. These things simply stand up. I write about this in my book, Daydream Believer. I write about it in Modern Occultism. I have an article on Substack, which is free, called Question Authorities. And it's about how the social sciences pathologize the paranormal. And they're just wrong. Intellectually, they've lost, but culturally, they've won. And culturally, they rule the roost. And that's not going to change
Well, here's a
probably in
question
my
for
life.
you. Here's a question for you because it certainly seems that way, and um, it's kind of like we have this sense of like, oh, the culture is against us, and it's like I don't know the German, but I think Heidegger had some made some point. He had a word for we have this sense in our head of the man out there thinks
Mhm,
this, which is a
mhm,
complete phantasm. Like the man on the
mhm,
street, it's a German word for like the man on the street. Like
mhm.
everyone knows that opinion is a phantasmal construct. But is that true? Because on the other hand, and I think if you look at Pew Research, the two fastest growing religions in the US are Islam, of course, but also neo-paganism, while
Yes.
Christianity is dying. And I think at least 25% of Americans believe in at least astrology or tarot or numerology or something like
Oh, yeah,
that.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that to me feels like a tiny cartel trying to maintain control when they never had probably never had it. I mean, I think what in my life, and I'm curious what you think, one of the things that has really struck me is, um, I will hear people tell me incredible paranormal experiences, ones I haven't had. And often the people who have the wildest ones are the most quote unquote normal.
Oh, yeah.
And why
I
that
feel
is,
that.
maybe they're not looking for it, so they're out of their way. Maybe some part of them needs it, so their world model can be shifted and become wider. I don't know. But why I wonder, is that really true that
Mm.
our culture is controlled in that way?
You're right, I should narrow my statement because it's really the culture of lettered opinion, and
Mm, okay.
it's true of Wiki, it's true of academia, not exclusively, because you find a lot more sympathy in the hard sciences, engineering, chemistry, biology, medicine, for the anomalous, the parapsychological, than you do within the humanities. Within the
Really?
human Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's news to me. That's
Yeah, yeah,
hilarious.
yeah.
That's hilarious.
This is according to survey results. Well, within the soft sciences, within the social sciences, cultural anthropology, cognitive psychology, etcetera, um, and within the humanities, there tends to be a very decided political outlook that I would say is in loose correlation to the Frankfurt School point of view, this idea that we have to keep searching for whomever the change agent is going to be in our culture who can fulfill the role that the poor workers failed to fulfill
Yeah, this is why I am
back in
convinced
the good
that
old days.
Marxism is another form of monotheism. It's got its
Oh,
messianism, it's got
it
its
absolutely
inevitability,
is.
all that. Yeah, yeah.
It's an Abrahamic faith. It's
Yep.
a secular Abrahamic faith with its own story of its own millenarianism, its own apocalypse, its own story of change agents and rapture and paradise or nirvana or
And
heaven.
the meek shall inherit the earth and the poor in spirit,
Absolutely.
all of this, all of yeah.
I mean, it's extraordinary. It's an Abrahamic faith. It just happens to be secular and economic in its nature versus a sin and salvation model. Although it is a sin and salvation model, just heaven is not elsewhere. Heaven is what's going to come after the uh, inevitable materialist dialectic results in the sought after revolution, i.e., the rapture. It's the same damn thing, and it's equally as elusive, and it's probably responsible at this juncture for more deaths than the shit that preceded it.
Yeah.
And
Well,
um,
also the prior form, and yeah, the treatment of religion under Marxist regimes has not been the best.
not the
It
best.
has not been the best. So it
Yes,
baffles me why people think this is a good idea. But anyways,
yeah.
um,
But you find those attitudes coloring the social sciences, the
okay,
humanities, and and there tends to be a greater opposition to the data of parapsychology, whereas in chemistry, biology, medicine, physics, there's simply a greater realization, inescapable, that boy, it really is a fucking weird world out there. So you talk to somebody in computer science who's been exposed to quantum computing, as I have
yeah,
not, most of the public has not, and they're gonna speak of things that are more
yeah.
fantastical than anything you or I could come up with.
Right. I
And
mean, it's like, John Dee. People think about John Dee and Enochian, but they forget John Dee was the guy that introduced geometry to England. That was a cult. That was considered hardcore occultism, geometry, Euclid's elements.
you
Um,
could be in his age, in pre-Elizabethan and even in Elizabethan England, although it was a little more relaxed under Queen Elizabeth, you could be imprisoned as he was under
yeah,
Mary, Queen of Scots, for calculating. Well,
that's
you
right.
know all about
Yeah,
this.
yeah, that's
This
right.
is
That's
like
right.
me
I
telling
forgot about
Jimmy
that. For
Page how to
you're
map
right.
the
Yeah, you're
Coast.
completely right for drawing a horoscope.
Yeah.
You're completely right. Um,
I realized telling Jason Louv about John Dee is like the
well, no,
equivalent of
here's the thing though. I think, now with AI, it's interesting because later on I'm going to run my John D book through AI and see how much I got wrong, and that'll be interesting.
But
Um,
bravo, bravo. I mean, this getting of things wrong. I get things wrong. I used to live in mortal fear of it because I grew up within this model of German Marxism, where textual faithfulness was considered akin to what we would call godliness in the
okay,
religions, and it was a hell of a training. It was a hell of a training. You want to see people who were Talmudic in their textual faithfulness
Marx,
encounter
yeah, yeah.
classical
I figured that's
Marxists.
because they couldn't actually get it to work. They just decided to kind of split hairs on like rabbinical type study of Marxist texts forever.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's human nature. I think that the reason the Marxists are so exacting is similar to the reason why some of us in the culture of esoteric search are so exacting. We think, if I could just find this recipe, if I could just get it right, find where the old keys were lost, everything will be fine. And
My
it's a
favorite
famous
my favorite take on that of all time, uh, the movie Willow. You remember that in the 80s? There's
what remind me of it.
it
It's
was like,
think of
kind of
quantum mechanics when
it
I hear
was a
Will.
fantasy movie. It was a kid's fantasy movie from the 80s that was centered on Willow, who was played by Warwick Davis, who also played Leprechaun. Like Leprechaun in the Hood, going on a quest, and it was kind of, Dungeons and Dragons adjacent. Anyways,
Oh,
long
I
story
don't know
short,
that.
it's similar to like Neverending Story, the '80s kids movie. There's a
Yeah,
part
great
where
day.
okay, so there's a part where Willow is initiated, gets his initiation into magic. And the initiation is everyone in the tribe is standing, or the group is standing around with their hands out, and they say, okay, point, or excuse me, the head of the initiation, like the head of the magical group, has his fingers out and says, point to the finger that does magic.
Mhm.
And it's a group initiation. So all these people keep coming up and pointing to different fingers, and they get it wrong. Willow comes up and he points to his own. And that's the right answer.
He
And I
points
always remember that.
to
He
what?
points to his, the question is, what's the finger that does magic? And people are trying to guess fingers on the Hierophant. And all the answers are wrong. Willow
Oh,
points to his own finger. That's the correct answer.
um, it Google's quantum computing model, which hasn't been released to the public yet, is named Willow. So,
Oh, you don't is
yeah,
that an AI model? Like
it's
a
a
quantum AI?
quantum computing model,
Oh,
and Google announced to the world um, last November that Willow was submitted a problem, a math problem by engineers so complex that it was estimated to require more than the known time in which the universe has existed and will exist to solve. And Willow, so we're told, solved it in under 5 minutes, which prompted the engineers to publicly ask whether this is a piece of evidence in support of a so-called multiverse or different dimensions or intersections of time. Because if Willow solved this problem, surpassing which was forecast to surpass the known existence and function of time, which is really a measurement of time, the answer, so the engineers presume, had to exist somewhere. So maybe it was plucked from a different dimension in our multiverse. And they publicly speculated about this. And this is akin to Bank of America publicly speculating about simulation theory.
wild.
When you've
I
got these
mean,
institutions, they sound like us.
right, no, that's the thing. I mean, or another one, it's like it's financial traders. I'm sure, especially in New York, you had, financial traders like, oh, like I wonder if I can correlate the markets to astrology or I Ching, or they have superstitious rituals. It's like,
Yeah.
so I think that these categories of skeptic, not skeptic, even categories like East and West are 19th century. I think they probably won't hold up going forward.
I
Uh,
I couldn't agree more, which is why intellectually, the argument for extreme physicalism is lost. And you mentioned financial traders, and I lit up because I first learned about what I was just describing to you in connection with Willow through financial traders. Financial traders can't wait to get their hands on
oh yeah,
quantum computing,
oh yeah,
and
anything
they
that'll
sound
help them
like
make a buck. Yeah, absolutely.
right, and they sound like
Fascinating.
fucking Timothy Leary, you know, if Tim's, object in life was to make money. And I like these guys to the extent that some of their maybe I say that too fast and loose. Their focus is single-minded, making money, and they don't give a fuck whether it's the multiverse or whether it's astrology or whether it's retrocausality. If it works, they're interested in it, and they're very interested in what I was just describing. And it's easier for me to talk to finance guys about metaphysics than it is to talk to your friendly neighborhood English professor because the finance guy is dealing more with data.
This is so
No
interesting.
aspersion on English professors.
Oh, what was that?
No aspersion on English
Definitely
professors.
not. I
Field
would,
I considered at
I
one point.
probably would have been one if I hadn't met Genesis Peerage. Um, um, so that brings me back to there's a point that I think that you were circling around, that you just circled back to. There's, I think, a really useful read there where you said that people in the hard sciences are more amenable than in the social sciences. So that
Mhm,
suggests to me, people in the hard sciences, same with financial traders, are used to approaching things experimentally and objectively, and they're open to being wrong. It's like
mhm.
if the math disproves your thing, it's like, you were saying you used to be afraid of being wrong. No, being wrong is great. If you can actually falsify something, you don't have to waste time on it anymore. You can go, that's part of the process of discovering the right answer. Um, so it's fascinating that they're amenable to it, but the social sciences are not, which suggests to me, and that essentially what the social sciences are a a a religious Marxist religious institution, right?
Mhm.
The reason they're rejecting it is not because of lack of evidence. It's because Marxism rejects spirituality altogether as a block to class consciousness.
And within the social sciences in general, and there are, I should add, in all fairness, great exceptions to what I'm talking about. There are social scientists listening who might feel alienated, and I don't want them to feel alienated because there are plenty of independent thinking people within every field, and I love them. But in general, en masse, the social sciences marshals its data, knowing exactly what it's looking for and getting exactly what it's looking for and sustaining
Mm.
this mass of tens of thousands of journals, many of them taxpayer supported,
Right,
that demonstrate
sustaining
exactly
funding,
what they want us to believe.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and for that matter, you'll see literature of self-help or literature of positive thinking or motivation or goal setting run down in social science papers in ways that are full of holes that I have dissected and taken apart. And they do this because the self-help project interrupts their idea of the psychologized role that wage earning and working people are supposed to occupy. Wage earning and working people flock to this literature. I have vastly more
Oh, yeah.
readers
Oh,
than
yeah.
its critics
Oh,
do,
yeah.
and they're supposed to be progressive. Well, I guess I must be more progressive if you measure it by who's reaching working people, because that's my readership,
No,
and I love it.
100%. I mean, it's like, I'm sure we both know tons of people. I personally have been this person where it's like, as I say, magic is the thing that when you have nothing else, it's like if you have if your back's to the wall, if you don't even have clothing left, you still have magic. You
Mhm,
still have your mind. You
mhm,
still have even if you don't wanna talk about ceremony magic, you probably shouldn't, but how many examples can we think of from history where just the fire, without anything else, just the fire and intelligence in somebody's mind and in their heart has changed the world, sometimes for the worst, out of
mhm.
from, many of the people who have changed the world, they didn't go get academic degrees, they came from the most unexpected places, often from complete nothing. And again, some pretty negative one. Hitler, unemployed artist in a homeless shelter, suddenly ends up, dictator of Germany
Mhm.
and mass murderer. And I think that one of the reasons why things like that are so frightening to so many people, other than the obvious, is it suggests that anything is possible for human
Yeah,
beings.
yeah,
It
and
really is.
yeah,
And I
and
think that the whole Marxist idea of reality, again, is so 19th century. It's based on the English factory system, which no longer exists. And
mhm,
the economics and the labor agreements around it no longer exist in the same
mhm,
way.
mhm,
And even in the developing world where things have been globalized, it's much different. So
mhm.
um, it's really observe. It's basically a response that did not work to a set of conditions which no longer exist. But,
I think
however,
there's
that said, the it explains perfectly why the social sciences, which are, largely, not surprising, the left, Marx is captured or whatever you want to talk about, or it's like I hate talking about like it sounded like Jordan Peterson, but I mean,
I know, I was just thinking that.
but
I
like the stream of conversation, what do you call it, like not the episteme, but like the discourse, the
yeah,
stream of discourse that starts with Marx and goes through Trotsky and then the Frankfurt School and Mao and the Alinsky and all the way up to the modern day and all of this. It's a huge, uh, heterodox, often group of ideas.
and
But all of them hate spirituality because they see it as like, it's the
yeah,
opiate of the masses. It's and I'm sure the other thing is, they basically see spirituality as a reactionary trick. But the other thing is, and I'm curious, 'cause you must have got this too. It always baffles me when I get this, where you start talking about magic or parapsychology, and then people immediately connect it with fascism. And I think
yeah,
it's this thing of reactionary far right politics often go into fantasy and mysticism and ideas of the Volk and the nation that are caught like in this dungeon, usually a revanchist thing. It's like a Dungeons and Dragons read of the history of the country. Same with Putin in invading Ukraine. So
mhm.
I think that people who are Marxist trained are, for whatever reason, primed to see anything that smacks of spirituality or imagination or fantasy as reactionary. I even saw the other day randomly, just because I was on the internet, I saw a critique of the movie Conan the Barbarian. from
Mhm,
1982, saying that is the most fascist screed ever put on screen, and so
mhm, mhm.
I mean, you must have got it. Always baffles me when I get that, but
Sure, sure. Um, it's a misunderstanding and it's a misreading of history. It reflects an inability to even define what fascism is, which is a compact of military, political, judicial, industrial power, usually with some sort of nationalist exclusivity and pageantry. And if that pageantry reaches backwards in time, as pageantry usually does, to find its symbols and its emblems and its insignias, it looks occult to us simply because occultism is a revivalist movement of pre-Abrahamic religious forms. And so if you're reaching backwards, you're going to find things, whether it's the caduceus of Mercury or the eagle or what have you, that look familiarly occult, whereas it's really an antique revivalist aesthetic that's at work. And of course, the idiots think that Madame Blavatsky was somehow responsible in this
right, right.
mysterious way for the Third Reich, and they cite books of hers that they haven't read and never will read, like The Secret Doctrine, misunderstanding that her concept of root races is all referenced in classical Vedism.
Yeah,
And
that has not. That's more like my understanding that that's more like generations of the totality of humanity on the planet. It has nothing to do with the races as people
nothing
dismiss it
whatsoever.
now.
And
Yeah,
I referenced earlier the Kali Yuga, which is an age of spiritual decline that extends for hundreds of thousands of years in the Vedas, depending upon one's interpretation. You'll find such things in aspects of Celtic spirituality as well. There's no simple box into which to place these things unless one's reading habits tend towards Wikipedia, in which case you found your box. But even on Wiki,
and your skeptic moderators.
yeah, your skeptic moderators. Even on Wiki, though, you'll find some modicum of justice for Madame Blavatsky, who had nothing to do with the gestation of these fascistic movements any more than occultism as a aesthetic and intellectual and spiritual movement touched everything in fin de siècle culture in the late 19th, early 20th century. No one likes to talk much about the extraordinary and and self-professed inspiration that she had over Mahatma Gandhi, who
Mm.
very publicly and very plainly expressed his e his encounter with Madame Blavatsky in London in the late 1880s when he was a law student there as having ignited his philosophy of religious and human universality. He specifically and repeatedly up until his assassination. In fact, just in an interview days before his assassination, said theosophy is Hinduism at its best. Theosophy is the love of man.
Wow, I had never heard that before.
Oh yeah, I
Because I
read
had
about
heard that
this.
the version of the story that I had heard is that that's so the version of the story is that Gandhi had been exposed to theosophy, but that he had lost interest in it, but that it had what instead it had sparked him to study Hinduism. Right? Is
Oh,
that
it did, and that is true. And
okay?
he didn't like the secrecy of theosophy, and he declined to ever become a member for that reason. But a person can go into my book, Occult America or Modern Occultism, and I encourage it, and look at my notes. Call me out if I'm exaggerating. If I'm exaggerating, call me out. If anything, I'm understating the fullness and the ebullience with which Gandhi credited Madame Blavatsky, especially stemming from that fateful meeting in London when he was a law student who was in danger of not matriculating because he was having a really hard time adjusting to life in London. And he said meeting her just ignited the entire impulse toward universality in his mind. But that's boring. That's boring. That kind of discussion doesn't allow you to absurdly call somebody a Nazi or point a finger at somebody. That's a that's anesthetizing to the nature of our culture.
If anything, I hear in the distance Indian nationalists' fury at Gandhi's universalism as it presumably led to the partitioning of Pakistan.
Yes. And there is that debate in India, and he's not universally popular for that reason, among others. But the notion that fascism and religion is linked, that's a moldy chestnut belonging to
Holy just
unexamined, inherited historical currents that don't hold up, that were never true. And what you were saying before is important to note. When we use terms, when I use terms like cultural Marxism, yeah, I start to sound like Jordan Peterson, and I don't like that. That's not. I'm not trying to adopt that kind of rhetoric, but it's difficult to avoid. Although I try to step around it to avoid these template phrases, which I don't like and I don't encourage, but there is an enormous influence of that secular
yeah, of
Abrahamic
course.
religion with its millenarian inevitability that has colored our culture.
Yeah.
And
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 I think
and
we're watching it break down right now, and the
it's breaking
popularity of
down.
Jordan
Yeah.
Peterson is one example of that.
But look at me. I'm right now studying the life of Vladimir Lenin because I'm interested in Lenin insofar as he too was a figure who, if I can speak in the most general of ways, was invested in a kind of self-development, self-improvement, self-help. He
Huh.
identified the novel, mid-19th century novel in Russia titled What Is to Be Done as his a kind of ethical guide, because in that novel, which I recently read, appears an anti-hero who is someone who seeks to strengthen himself personally, ethically, physically, as a kind of a cultural Superman, Ubermensch, or change agent. And Lenin took it upon himself to
Interesting.
echo the tribulations of that character as a means of strengthening himself. He was an ardent believer in self-development, even as much as he was an ardent secularist. And I always find those epics of history interesting when some individual who became very, oh, I don't know, hugely seismic in influence, who lived long enough to see through some agentic plans in the world, what was his or her program
Yeah.
of
Yeah,
self-development.
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
find one
yeah,
in
yeah.
Lenin's life, and it's very interesting.
That is fascinating. I mean, that's such a fascinating question and applicable. And I think that that question is such a great way to approach magic. I mean, it's kind of like I tell people sometimes, if you want to learn about magic, don't read occult books, except for Esoterica, which everyone should immediately rush out and buy. Um, but I tell people read biographies,
Mm.
because then you'll see how people have actually lived and actually applied whatever it is in real life, and you'll learn more about. Often, you read, like, I'm always shocked. It's like I'll just go up and this happens to me. I'll just go pick up a biography of a famous person and open it. It's like Bill Clinton, open it. Now he's talking about being in a voodoo ritual in Haiti. Okay,
Mhm. Mhm.
great, wonderful. Or Donald Trump. I picked up one of those the Donald Trump book that he did with Robert Kiyosaki, and he's talking about Jung and the Kabbalah in it. I'm like, get the it's like, no, for
Right,
real. Yeah, I think I
right,
forget what's
right.
one of the books he did with Robert Kiyosaki. I don't remember which one. And of course, Norman Vincent Peale and
Yeah,
all of that. So for me, the
yeah.
question is like, okay, well, what are they doing that's work? It's a very NLP approach. It's like, what are they doing that's working, and how can we reproduce and replicate it?
I think that's fascinating observation. I think that's wonderful advice for people. And I devour biographies from time to time for similar reasons. I was reading a biography of Bill Clinton that when he was younger, he had trained himself to sleep on 6 hours a night. I'm not sure how healthy that is. I'm not sure how sustainable that is, but it was just something to note that he tried in his path of self-development.
Interesting. Um, what do you think of Alice Bailey? Because as you were talking about this, we talked about parapsychology and the right, but there, of course, is also a history of parapsychology on the left. And Alice Bailey is somebody that, just because we brought up Theosophy, has been fascinating, but I've never done a full deep dive on. But I know that from what I've gathered, her concept of the New Age, which might be a gloss of Crowley's New Aeon, but I believe Bailey is the source for the idea New Age, the actual phrase, but she basically saw it as a front for the spread of socialist ideas, and that the New Age was a socialist, essentially a socialist front.
I have an article. I write about Bailey in my book, Modern Occultism, and I have an article on Wikipedia, not Wikipedia, I'm sorry, Substack, which is free, called, um,
How do people find her Substack, by the way?
oh, it's the newsletter is called Mystery Achievement. And there's free stuff on there. There's paywall stuff on there. The Bailey piece, I think, is free. And I think it's titled something to the effect of Alice Bailey, Perils of Progress of a Modern Occultist.
Hmm.
Bailey certainly did prove an early user of the term New Age, although I trace its gestation to William Blake, who very
Oh,
blatantly used
really?
it. Yeah.
Really?
Uh,
Okay. Okay.
Rouse up, O ye young men of the New Age, he wrote in a, a tribute to John Milton.
What do you know? Okay.
And I referenced that in this article. And then there were other people who used it in the interim, including Warren Felt Evans. He was a mind cure minister here in the United States. A.R. Oraj, who was a close student of G.I. Gurdjieff, and Bailey used it certainly, but she was early. She's a remarkable figure. She attempted suicide several times when she was young. She succeeded in ways that I think you would have considered dramatically against the odds. Eleanor Roosevelt recited Bailey's prayer, the Grand Invocation, over the radio in celebration of International Human Rights Day. I also think that Bailey harbored some old world prejudices against blacks, Jews, gays that were just absurd, especially following the Second World War. And even in the years after the Second World War, she continued to voice that stuff.
Hmm.
And it simply goes to show that you can accumulate wisdom. And one has to ask the question, does it penetrate being? Because these statements that she made were very ordinary, very commonplace, and the mid-20th century was a little late for this stuff to be getting
Yeah,
said.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that was the whole, I mean, that was the era of the Frankfurt School construction for specifically
Yeah.
that reason. And I think that um I think the Frankfurt School is worth studying, but not necessarily
Mhm.
not for the Jordan Peterson reason. I think that the for me personally, everything that we are experiencing is still an echo of World War II,
Mhm.
and that will, and because it was a fairly traumatic event for the whole planet. Uh, and I think that going back to that earlier statement of there's this equation that I think that people on the left have, which is certainly understandable for the time, which is fantasy and spiritualism equals reactionary politics equals Auschwitz. And I
Yeah.
think that was the equation that a lot of the Frankfurt School and people like Bruno Bettelheim and that drew. And I think their goal to uh, essentially drive towards postmodernism, plurality, great, right? But of course, everything breaks down at the end. Everything falsifies itself. But I think that this fear of the spiritual world is a fear that that perhaps would bring us back to that time. And I think that that's certainly something valid to be afraid of because there's lots of indicators of it in the world right now.
Mm.
But I don't think that while that equation, whether it was conscious or not, I think made perfect sense in the 1950s. It
There's
doesn't as much now.
yeah, it's interesting. I think you're right, that 1950s Frankfurt view that religion is a through line to fascism, to the Gulag, to Auschwitz, and
Yep,
so forth.
yep, yep, yep.
It lingers over our culture with this peculiar wrinkle, which is that it's difficult to speak nowadays in terms of left and right because it's all fraying. But to the extent to which we can, the left has found its voice in I would say, and forgive me because I'm really speaking generally, but it has found its voice in a kind of anti-Westernism, so
Mhm.
that religion, as long as it's exotic and seen as being non or anti-Western, doesn't fit into that particular paradigm. And that becomes a very arid place from which to argue. And that's why I have to monitor myself in terms of generality. I also have to look to my own experience to verify some of these things. When I was younger, I was youth section treasurer at DSA, and I balanced that goddamn budget. I can assure you,
All right.
proud of the work I did. I was interested in spirituality at that time. I was considered to be a kind of, what did people call me? They used to call me a right wing green because I was interested in spirituality.
Fascism.
Even though I was youth section treasurer.
Right, there
Anyway,
you go.
um, I was very interested um, in spirituality at that time, and although it was secondary to my political interests, but I never viewed any of that as part of my political gestation or reality. And I look, for example, at another protean being, Ayn Rand,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
very similar in nature, Russian woman like Blavatsky remade herself, probably her greatest mark,
Brilliant woman, whatever one
brilliant
thinks of her
woman.
politics, brilliant woman.
Her capacity to remake herself, to
Yeah.
come to America, to flee Stalinist Russia without a full command of the language and become a screenwriter in Hollywood, a novelist. People
It's
can't evaluate
yeah.
what that requires, but her political outlook, is completely materialist, completely physicalist, and I just don't see how these generalizations hold up. To her, the nature of mysticism was a nature of delusion that she grouped with collective politics, which she thought was the ultimate destructive delusion.
Which
Uh,
coming from where the background she came from is, fair enough. Like, again, it's like,
it
yeah,
was
fair
scarring,
enough,
scarring. And what I'm really trying to get across is that the search is contemplative, the search is individual, the search is unruly. You were citing that Pew poll that talked about the numbers of Americans who believe in New Age themes. I wrote about this not long ago.
Okay.
A
Okay.
not insignificant fraction of those Americans identify as Christians or as Catholics. I remember reading something to the effect of 25% of identified Catholics in that same Pew poll uh, lend validity to astrology. And
Oh,
I thought
yeah.
that was kind
Just
of
go
interesting.
to yeah, come down to New Orleans, It's
Right,
this
exactly.
this is what I think it's like it also like, this idea of categorizing and siloing of belief, I don't think it bears out in the real world. We know, for instance, this idea when we talk about Greek religion, Egyptian religion, they were back and forth trading. It was all a conversation. It's all mixed
Completely.
together. The East, what this idea of Eastern mysticism, they cross-pollinated from Western as well. And, all the old categories are, particularly now in the age of AI, um, yeah, I don't think I think that just human experience is it just is what it is, and all these things
It's
are
messy.
present in it, but
It's messy, and we're all individuals. And I will not evaluate someone other than as an individual. And conduct and the experience of the individual, if I must evaluate, is really all I care about. And if I must be evaluated, I ask to be submitted to that.
right. Well, I need to take a tab of acid in about 1 minute in order to come up when the full moon is at its peak.
All right.
So, this I I would love there's so much more I wanna talk about, and, we could keep going for a while, but you should definitely tell people where to get your book and where to find more about you.
Well, Esoterica is available wherever you buy books in physical form, digital form, audio, which I narrate. People can find me on Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23, X at Mitch Horowitz, my website, mitchhorowitz.com. And um, I'm glad to have been able to join you. It's been too long since you and I last spoke.
Yeah,
And
let's speak again soon. It has
glad to
been a
be down
while.
for
The world's been
yeah.
a mess. Good
A
God.
damn mess, yeah.
Ugh,
But
ugh,
here we are.
exhausting. Yeah.
And
But,
I'm
yeah, here we are.
appreciative to you and to your audience for all the
Right.
explorations.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mitch, and this was a great conversation, and, I'm wishing you great luck with the book. Everyone watching, go buy it now. Get them up on Amazon rankings.
Thank you.
Alright.